President Trump is considering the next iteration of his controversial travel ban as the current one reaches its expiration date. The U.S. ban on visitors from 6 predominantly Muslim countries is set to expire this coming Sunday, 90 days after it took effect. Now the Department of Homeland Security is recommending more targeted restrictions affecting a larger number of countries. CBS News White House senior foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan is in Somerset, New Jersey, covering the president. Good to see you, Margaret. Elaine Duke, the acting Homeland Security Secretary, sent her recommendations for what she called tough and tailored replacements to this ban to the White House. Do we know what those changes will be?
We know some of what was recommended, but the president still hasn't made a decision. So depending on what he decides, it'll determine who's on the list and exactly what the restrictions will be. So until then, countries are sort of waiting to hear how it's going to impact their nationals. What we do know is that it takes effect after that 6-country travel ban expires on Sunday. And because it is still a little murky at this point, what we know from the guidance that has been delivered from the Department of Homeland Security is that they're really trying to lay the groundwork to try to avoid the kind of chaotic rollout that happened with that first iteration of a travel ban. They're also emphasizing that these are travel restrictions, not a total ban. So it's not going to be a total block on all people from individual countries. There will be carve-outs, but all of that is pending. The president's got to sign off.
And we were looking at a tweet from the president where he says this new ban should be larger and tougher. But there may be a difference between the policy he wants and what he thinks is possible. Of course, the first ban came under heavy criticism, was even put on hold by some courts, although the Supreme Court was a little kinder to it. We know the Supreme Court is going to hear oral arguments on the ban in 2 weeks. Do we have any sense of how this new ban could affect these court cases?
Well, these are being carefully tailored as restrictions, not a complete ban. And the reason that they're being so careful in the language and in the particulars of who this affects and how, and giving windows of notification of 50 days, the Department of Homeland Security had the State Department speaking to each country that they had flagged. There were originally around 15 or more countries that were of concern. They whittled that down to around 8 or so. That's on the list on the president's desk right now. And they're trying to avoid not just the chaotic rollout, but some of the practical complications. Because as you say, there are these legal issues with the pending Supreme Court case, but there's also just a practical issue here. Remember, that original list of 7 countries had Iraq on it, a country where U.S. troops were fighting on the battlefield alongside Iraqi soldiers against ISIS. This caused a lot of embarrassment and a lot of complication for U.S. national security officials who were trying to work with their Iraqi partners at the time. The administration doesn't want a repeat. They don't want to be basically complicating their own broader strategies. So they're really trying to coordinate things more, and they really are also trying to emphasize that this is tailored, this is justified, they're going to argue. They're going to say this has to do with countries either they can't provide the information the U.S. wants. You know, if it's not a very highly developed country, then they don't have all the sorts of deeply resourced and quickly available individual data and biometrics on people. Maybe they can't provide the information the United States is asking for. It may not be that they are necessarily a country that the U.S. doesn't fully trust. It's just they can't provide the information that the U.S. needs in order to grant their nationals entry. But there are also those countries that are problematic for the U.S. Remember, Iran was on that original list. I would be very surprised if it doesn't remain on the new travel restriction list as well.
Margaret, quickly, a lot of Supreme Court watchers think that the ban is actually going to do pretty well at the court, that they're going to uphold it in whole or in part. Does the administration have that feeling? Do they think their concerns are more all those other things you mentioned and not necessarily the court?
Absolutely. They see this as a totally divided issue. They believe that on the merits, on the legalities, when it comes to the power of the executive to determine who poses a national security threat to Americans and who can enter the country, is totally within the president's right. They will defend that. They were happy to defend that. They were, in fact, they said eager to defend it. Remember, President Trump was out there saying, let's fight this. Let's take this to the Supreme Court. From day one, he was is ready to do that. But then there's this second issue here, which gets into the more complicated parts of this, which is what was the intent behind it? Was it truly, and is it really, a religiously based targeted Muslim ban that doesn't have the kind of legal justifications that would prove that the president had a reason to single out these countries in the first place? So they think on the merits they can win in terms of the power of the executive. As to the justification, that's where it gets complicated, and that's where it's going to get interesting. I know our colleague Jan Crawford, who knows the Supreme Court inside and out, could really talk to you about what the justices will look at there. But I can say the Trump administration has always been confident they'd win in court. They weren't so confident, however, that they could roll this out without a hitch, because they had so many problems with the first and second iteration, and they weren't so confident they could win over public opinion on this, because remember, there were so many families who found themselves caught in these terrible situations with family members who couldn't enter the country when they needed to, et cetera. So they're trying to manage that part, but on the court case, they're pretty confident.
Okay, Margaret Brennan traveling with the president. Margaret, thanks.